my pleasure to introduce Sister Mary, the president of our college, to speak with us tonight at Agape Latte. This is such a special treat for our students to get to know Sister Mary on a different level tonight. As many of you know, this is Sister Mary's last year at the Elms, and this is the perfect time for her to come to talk to us about transformational change. This is also a chance for the community to get to know a lighter side of Sister Mary. For example, some facts about her is that her favorite food at the calf is chicken fried and buttermilk with mashed potatoes. Some of her hobbies include golfing, reading, and traveling, and when she watches TV, she usually turns on the PBS shows are her favorite. So without further ado, let's introduce Sister Mary Reed.
You didn't know I golfed? It's one of my favorite pastimes. So thanks for inviting me. This is a really, on one way, it's a nice thing to do. On the other hand, it's a little bit hard, because you're not used to talking about yourself, and when you get to be my age, there are a lot of transformational moments. So I had to kind of cull them down and just try to do it in some organized way. I saw that on the poster you had put a butterfly, and you had the different kind of evolution of the butterfly through the various stages. And I thought it was a pretty good metaphor for most of us in life, that we move through different stages, and when we're doing it, I don't think we're really aware of significant moments or the things that may impact us. Just like you now, you go to classes, you study certain things happen, you meet people, but you can only really reflect on it fully, I think, in retrospect. Probably 25 years from now, when you come back for your reunions, you'll be saying, wow, I didn't realize at the time that was so important for me, or it made such a difference in my life. So I have the advantage, if you can call it that, of being able to do the retrospect and look back and say, well, how did my life unfold? What were some of the evolutions? So I'll just put a few out for you, and then I'm going to try not to say too much about any of them. You don't want an hour lecture here, and it's a long life, so there's several chapters. But then if you want to talk about a couple of them, or maybe more information about it, I'll be glad to have a conversation with you. So let me just tell you that I was born right outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania. I had two brothers and a sister. There were four of us. My brother died last year, so there are the three of us, my one older brother and my sister still living. And so we moved to Binghamton when I was very young, during the war. That was World War II. But anyway, my parents moved there during the war, so I grew up there. But I came from a very large family. My mother had 14 brothers and sisters, and my dad had 12. But I thought everybody did. And many of you are from those very large families. And one of the things that really influences your life, I think, is all that extended family you have and all the cousins and the relatives that you have. You don't realize it at the time, but it's really very much a part of your experience and how you live your life later on, because of the way people affect you as you see them in your family. So that was a big part of my life. I went to public school. I never went to Catholic school until I went to college. So there wasn't much about being in school that I could remember that was really significant during my formative years, except that I remember very clearly that when we were in 4th grade, there was a symphony orchestra in our town, in our city, in Binghamton. And there was a program, I think it might have been state funded, I'm not sure, but at any rate, they used to bring musical instruments to the school. And we could pick one out if we wanted to and take it home with us. And then we had a little orchestra in the school, and we could pick that instrument. So I was thinking of you because I picked the violin. And I played the violin really forever. After that, I played in a symphony orchestra, I played in a quartet, and I started out just as a little kid in 4th grade. It was bigger than I was at that time. And I had to lug it back and forth, and I hated it because I had to carry it to school and back and forth, and my friends used to tease me about it. But it was a really wonderful part of my life, and I really think it made a big influence in terms of my love, my lifelong love of music. So now I play it for myself, but I don't play in public any longer. But it was probably the thing I remember most about all those years. So then the next big moment, I think, probably for most of you too, was where do I go to college? What was that decision all about? So I'll just tell you that my parents, probably like yours, took me to a lot of different campuses, and you know, I would look at them and say, okay, that was all right, and nothing really hit me. But because of that very large family I have, the one place I did not want to go was Marywood, which is in Scranton. I didn't want to go back in the midst of that big family. So out of desperation, my mother one day just said to me, let's just go and look at it. You don't have to go there, but because I had aunts who had gone there and other relatives. Anyway, I wasn't in the rotunda 5 minutes. And this nun, who I thought was ancient at the time, she's probably a lot younger than I am now, came out and started to talk to me. In like 10 minutes, I knew that's where I was going to go to school. Probably like the feeling some of you had when you came on this campus. And that was transformational for me, because that decision to go to Marywood affected so many decisions throughout my life. So after 2 years of being at the college, I entered. That was probably the next significant transformational moment for me, because I moved from being a college student like you to suddenly finding myself in a very strange world of nuns. And at that time, unlike young women or young men who go into religious life today, you kind of know what you're getting into, because you spend a lot of time before you ever go in, living with people and mixing with them. But you have to remember when I entered 1,000 years ago, religious life was really very monastic. And that's when they wore the old habits, they didn't mix with people. So I really entered not really knowing what religious life was going to be like. And so I just remember, I'll just give you one example of the surprise factor, because there were, I think there were 40 of us who entered the day I did. And that night at dinner, a little bell rang, and we were welcomed, and the sister who was in charge of us said, ladies, since tonight is your first night in the convent, we'll have recreation for dinner as a celebration. Huh? I said, what does that mean? Oh, she said, we don't talk at dinner. Oh, we all said, we'll change that. That was the last time I spoke at dinner for a long time. But it was a very different time to enter religious life. It was very monastic. We did not mix. I could not go home. I could not eat in front of what we called then seculars. And we just, so it was very difficult for me, because I was on the same campus where I had been a student with all my friends, and now I was not able to talk to them as I would meet them or see them on the campus. So that was a really big transformation. I mean, you really had to want religious life to go through all of that. I used to call it boot camp, because it was really very difficult transition for me. And then the only other thing that happened during that young period of my life was that we started to make changes in religious life around that time. And so I had spent 3 or 4 years really being very removed from everything. And one Sunday, the directors just came and said, the president of the college wants to talk to you on the phone. I almost wanted to say, what's a phone? I hadn't been on the phone in 3 years. And it was, you know, like she called me every Sunday. So the question was, in 2 seconds, my future was decided, because she said, well, we've decided with the changes in religious life, we're going to send a few of you back to the college. And so I want to know what it is you'd like to study. Well, we hadn't read newspapers, I couldn't read books, I couldn't read magazines, so I said I want to study English, because I figured then I could read books and things I wanted to read. Oh no, dear, we have enough English teachers. I see that you took some Spanish. You can be a Spanish teacher. And in that moment, so much about the rest of my life was decided Now, I didn't see that then. I was mad as a hatter. I didn't want to do Spanish at all. But you didn't get to say, oh no, thanks, but I want to do something else. So later on, as I looked back, it was that language experience that provided for me opportunities that other sisters at that time in religious life didn't have. Just a couple years after that, there was a big move in the church to educate young religious in Spanish, to serve the needs of the church, especially in Latin America. And so a group of us were invited to go to Puerto Rico for the summer. And it was right at that time when we were changing. It was a great summer. So off I went to Puerto Rico and had a summer away with all kinds of people. And that was something different that I got to do. And a couple years later, with the same idea of Spanish, and they wanted me to teach Spanish, so I had an opportunity to go to the University of Madrid, and off I went to Europe and studied. And so that moment, of transformation, when I said yes to doing Spanish, which I really did not want to do, really shaped a lot of the things I was allowed to do later. So we went through all the changes in religious life. I entered a lot of various ministries. I started out teaching 6th grade in Brooklyn. That was my first assignment. I loved it. I wanted to do it for the rest of my life. And so, of course, I was a Spanish major, and I got to teach English and music. So it had nothing to do with what I had a degree in, but that's how it was in those days. They needed somebody in Brooklyn, off you went. But at the end of that year, then I was sent to high school, and I began teaching Spanish. And I was the first sister, because of the changes in religious life. The next big thing that happened was, I don't know where I got this idea, but I wanted to move out of teaching, and I wanted to go into social services. I wanted to work with the large immigrant community that had come to Long Island, which is where I was at the time. So we didn't do that kind of thing in my community. You were either a nurse or you were a teacher. That was it. But after about 3 years of begging to do this, I was told I could do it. So I went and got a contract with a parish on Long Beach Island. And I tell you that story because I signed the contract in the morning, and that night, when you talk about transformation, I got a call from the president of the college. And the sister who had been teaching Spanish had become very ill. This is August. So she said, will you come to the college for 1 year? I know you just signed a contract. I know you were just given permission to go into social service, but I need someone at the college. And it was one of those moments, again, that you just don't say no to your congregation when it needs you. So I said, okay, I'll come for a year. So I did. At the end of the year, I left. I did do social service. I came back to Marywood one summer for something, and I met this sister who was very instrumental in my life. When you think about the people who change your life, and she said to me, when you get sick of that social service work, you belong here at the college, you give me a call. So a year or two later I did, and that was how I began to work in higher education. So in my middle years, there was a lot of ministry work and moving from place to place, and then eventually ending up at the college, going to do my doctorate, coming back then to really be a faculty member in the education department. And then I was asked to be academic dean, which I did. And then 2 years after that, this same sister who had invited me back was retiring. And so I was in my early 40s then, and there was a push for all of us who were eligible to apply for the presidency, so there'd be a good pool. So I thought it'd be a good exercise to go through the interview so that one day when I might be really doing it for real, maybe I would have a better idea of what you had to do. So I went for the interview, and then they had a search committee, just like you're going to have here, and we all went through the process of applying, and then I got a phone call to say that I had been selected as the president. I didn't have a clue what that meant. But anyway, 19 years later, I had it pretty much figured out as I was president for 19 years. So those were the things of my middle years, I think, and those transformational moments of, and I think the thing that helped select me as president was because of that Spanish. I had done different ministries, I had traveled abroad, I had studied abroad, I had taught English as a second language. One of the claims to fame I had was that I was a dorm director for 8 years. I could spend the night telling you stories about that. But I lived in the dorm for 8 years. And also I was an international student advisor. So all those things were connected to that language. And then when I applied to the presidency, it just meant that I had a lot of experiences that other people hadn't had in the institution. And so it all added up to being the one that was selected. So, you know, I think that, and then culminating in becoming president and then doing that for 19 years. So those were the middle years. Now here I am, starting the next chapter in my life, those older years. There's a lot of transformation there, more than I ever could have imagined. One of the things after leaving Marywood was I retired. That didn't work out so well. I was bored and I didn't really want to do that, but I had a couple of years in there because I was the caretaker for my mother, who lived to be 101. And so I took care of her over that period of time, but just as this opening came at Elms College, I knew that my mother wasn't going to live very much longer, and I knew that I needed to get a new life for myself, and so I applied here. And so if you want to say my older years, started with really the transformation of coming here and evolving into the second presidency of coming here. And I got to tell you, I'm so glad I did. What a wonderful school this is, and what a wonderful group of people. I wasn't sure when I came here because I was at my own college. I mean, I had graduated from Marywood, I had entered at Marywood. My life was centered around that, and so leaving all of that and coming here, I thought, how is that going to work? But it was just magical, and I think it was a great match, and it's been a wonderful 8 years. And I just have to say to you, this is a very special place, and I've learned that over my time here. And I know that you treasure that, but I could say as somebody who came from outside, you're absolutely right, that there is something very special about the whole spirit and atmosphere of this college. So it's just been a really blessing of my older years to have served here as the president. Then there are those other transformational moments you have as you get a little bit older. You're far, far away from this, but I'm just setting you up because it will come faster than you know, faster than you can think about it now. Your friends begin to pass on. That was a big shock to me. The first few, I thought, oh, what a shock, what a surprise. I wonder what happened to them. Well, by the time you get to a good number of them, you figure, oh, it's our generation. So that's a part of older life that's very hard. Letting go of your family, letting go of your friends, and accepting all of those things about entering older. You get physical limitations, and you know you can't do some of the things you used to do when you were younger. So that's not all so easy. And so this chapter will end in June, that I'll move to another transformational moment when I really retire, I think. I'm going back to Scranton, so it's like a circle. I started there at Marywood, and I'll go back there now in retirement, and we'll see what happens. You don't know, but I think I would just say over all my own transformational moments, and as you think of yours, because you're just starting out, a lot of it is, it's more accident, it's of the moment rather than something that's really something at the moment you think is really significant. It's only as I look back and say, well, how did I get here? How did all this happen? What was the root? And most of it was just an encounter with a person, somebody you really thought a lot of, who pushed you or encouraged you or helped you believe in yourself, moved you to do the next thing that maybe you weren't sure you even could or should do. And somehow you make those momentary decisions. You know, I've used this before, but you know, when Solzhenitsyn was accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, he said, you know, there's only a few steps, kind of big steps, up to the stage to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. But the significant steps are the thousands of small steps that were made throughout his life and the lives of other people who journeyed with him to bring him to that moment. And I leave you with that thought, because I think that really is how life evolves. It's moment by moment, small decisions you make, and at certain points in your life they add up, or there's a moment where the road turns and you take it. And it doesn't mean that there couldn't have been lots of other turns in the road that probably would have been very fulfilling and given you a very happy life as well. But as I look back on my own life, I feel very blessed and feel that somehow it all worked out, even though at the moment when I was making those decisions, I really wasn't quite sure they were right, or that they were the best thing to do, or even that they were going to last. But they did, and you move on, and life just takes its own journey. So I'm sure that as you think about your own memoirs and your stories up to date, you can even already go back to, your young life and your family life, and maybe even things you decided to do while you're here. Maybe small steps, but when you look back later on, they were all making you the person you will become. So I'll leave you with that. It's just a kind of an overview of how certain moments are transformational, and just like the butterfly, you go from that little, caterpillar, and eventually you begin to take some wings on and move forward with your life, professionally and personally. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So I jumped over a few things, I know, so if anybody wants me to fill in a few blanks or talk about something. Michael?
Yeah, so, a lot of us in a very few amount of time, very small amount of time, are going to face, like, the job market, and maybe be put in the position that you were when you had, gotten to the presidency. We have the education to take on those challenges, but can you elaborate a little bit on, like, some challenges you may have faced when you were, you were accepted as the president, maybe not having felt like you really were qualified for the job or knew what to do?
Sure. Michael's question is, you're all going out into the job market pretty soon, and so when I first became president, how did I feel? Did I feel prepared? Did I know what I was doing? I didn't have a clue. I remember sitting in the chair the first day, looking at my secretary and saying, "What do you think we do now?" And she said, "We just wait, it'll come to us." And it's like everything else. You take what's in front of you, so in your job, whatever it is you choose, and it's okay to choose and know it's not the ultimate. It's not going to be your last job. It's not going to be, the breaker of your life's joy and value. But you kind of think it's a good starting place, I'm going to take it. So as I sat in the president's chair, I learned every day. I made terrible mistakes. I made many, many mistakes, but I learned from those mistakes. And as I went on, I became a better and better president, not because of the things that went right, because of the things that didn't go so right, that I thought, I'll never do that again. That was not a good thing to do, and how could I do that better? How could I do it differently? And that's what's going to happen to you as you take those first jobs. You may get fired. You may decide it was a wrong choice. Lots of things can happen in those first, and probably some of you have had that already. And that's okay. That's life's learning experiences. But you just dust yourself off and you say, what do I learn from that? And now I know more than I did, and I'll move on to the next place. So the presidency for me evolved, and I made lots of errors and had lots of challenges, but I also had good people who I listened to and who helped me. So I think that's the other thing. Talk to people you care about, who care about you, and just listen and get good information and decide important things slowly. I think if I could say one thing, you always get to decide, but you don't have to decide in an instant. And so it's always good to get input, to get information, to talk to people who are older than you, who are good mentors, people you value. You don't have to take their advice, but it helps you decide your own choices with more information and more certainty because you've talked to them. John?
So there's a lot of questions I'd like to ask you, but I guess the biggest one I have is, where do you think you got your self-discipline from? Because to dedicate your life to religious service like you did, it clearly takes a lot of self-discipline. So where do you think that came from? How do you think that impacted your life?
Okay, John's question is, how did I get self-discipline? He thinks I have it. And how did it affect my life? I hadn't thought too much about that. I think probably, well, some of it came from home, I'll tell you that. My mother was a very strong mother. So we were self-disciplined, and if not, she would have disciplined us for us. So you learn some of it there, and I think when you have siblings and a lot of extended family, you learn some of it like you all did. In terms of, probably for me, I learned a lot of it in religious life. Religious life is really not a very natural life. Can you imagine a lot of women living together in one place? So if you want to talk about having to develop self-discipline, you know, you can go crazy over everything about where they put the cereal in the cupboard, you know, because most people are not height challenged like some of us are, and so they put the cereal on the third shelf. But that would make me really mad. And so we would move it down to the second shelf, and the next day it would be on the third shelf. So at a certain point you have to say, you know what, I can't go crazy over where they put the cereal. So you just have to remove yourself from that. And again, I think it's, you develop it in little things. You just develop it about yourself. And I think the structure of religious life when I entered helped us develop a lot of self-discipline, because it was very monastic, very rigid. We made no decisions. A bell rang and you jumped and you did what you were told and you didn't question. And so living in that kind of environment, I think, just helped us develop a discipline because you had to. You knew what time to get up, when you went to bed, what you wore, what you ate, you know, when you prayed, when you worked. And so maybe that contributed to some of it. And then the rest of it, I think you just learn by interacting with a lot of people, and you can't always have your way, and you can't lose your temper. That was the hardest thing for me. Maybe that's the essence of your question. When I was young, and I was a young administrator, I would be very sharp and very short and make up my mind very quickly, and sometimes not always nicely. And it was only over time that I learned the discipline of taking a breath and not showing anger and just staying composed. And that's something you learn by doing, because you don't like yourself after you do it a few times, and so you say, I want to do that again. So you begin to self-discipline and make yourself back up a little bit. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's part of it anyway. Anybody else? Sure.
I know you said that religious life has changed, obviously, since you began. Is there anything that modern people or modern religious life do now that you wish you had the opportunity when you were first entering? I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Well, I wish I could have chosen my major. I wouldn't have chosen Spanish. You know, it's a good question, because in some ways, yes, there are more choices, and sometimes that makes the life harder, because you do have to do a lot more yourself, and you have to make a lot of decisions about self-discipline, about if you're going to pray, when you're going to pray, how you're going to live your life. There are lots of opportunities to live in lots of different ways, and so it puts a lot more on the person. But I would also say this about religious life at the current moment, which I think is very encouraging. When we were young religious, the emphasis really was, it was on your ministry and what we did, but a great part of our life, probably the more important part of our life, centered around our prayer life. That was a very structured part of our lives, and there was a lot of time and attention given to it. And then as we became busier and went into more ministries and lived differently, lived in apartments and lived singly, that sense of community, that thing that bound us together, was diffused a little bit. I think we lost some of it in the shuffling. And I would say in the last 5 to 8 years or so, religious life, in my opinion, at least in my congregation, is rediscovering the contemplative prayer life and how central that is to our religious life. And so where before, living in large institutions with a lot of people and doing the similar work, I think was what bound us together as congregations and communities. I think today there's a movement afoot that is pulling us very deep into contemplative prayer individually and as congregations, as almost a countercultural approach to violence and to some of the behaviors that we see, undisciplined behaviors that we see in the world. And so we spend a lot more time at our meetings and together in periods of contemplative prayer and then coming to decisions out of that. I don't know how many of you were aware a few years ago that Rome had a big study of religious, all worldwide religious women, but it was really about American women as much as anything. They didn't like some of the things we were doing, some of the ways in which we were living our lives. But we have a national organization of all the leadership of our congregations, and their response to that very difficult period of time of a couple of years was to gather together from around the world, and every time they met and worked out of a stance of contemplation. They spent hours and hours praying together in that spirit of contemplation. And at the end of the day, they made a tremendous impact on Rome. And the kind of criticism and suspicion that was raised about us really, for the most part, dissolved. Now, part of that was the change in leadership in the church. Pope Francis, as you know, is very open to a lot of different things and much more pastoral, and so that helped us. But it was really the answer, I think, to your question. There are a lot of different things about our lives today than certainly when I entered. I wore the old habit and lived that very monastic life. But today, it's interesting that we're being called back to the essence of religious life. We kind of went this way. The pendulum always swings. So we did a lot of different ministries, and that became very important to us. And now we're being called back, centered into a very, I think you'll see a different type of religious life in your next 10, 20 years.
I have one last question. So, if you could go back in time and speak to yourself when you were a college student, what's one piece of advice you'd want to give yourself?
If I could go back in time to when I was a college, that's ancient history. When I was a college, what advice would I give to myself? I think to just live life to the fullest, to enjoy it. For where I stand today, life is very short in terms of how long we live, and things go by very quickly. And so sometimes when you're older, you sit and think of some of the wasted things, or the things that upset you, or the things that you thought mattered, and they don't. I think to enjoy your friends and your family, and to make the most of every day. I think I did that pretty well. I always enjoyed my life, but that, I guess if I could leave you with a thought, I would say a lot of what you worry about, a lot of the things that give you heartburn or scare you, or, they're not so bad. They're not so bad. And life will be good for you for the most part. And when it isn't, you have a big reservoir to call on to help you do the right thing and to get through the difficult days. And that's life. You're going to have the good times and the bad times. And it's just all in how you learn to handle it and not to give in and not to give up. You know, you always dust yourself off, learn from what happens, and just live life to the fullest and enjoy it, because it's just it's a wonderful adventure. Anybody else?
I just have one more. I want to get into school administration one day. That's just a goal of mine. What's one thing or one piece of advice you think that you would give to someone who would be interested in a field like that?
Get as many experiences as you can. Work in very different areas. If it's higher ed that you want, then work in as many different areas as you can. Get lots of experiences. There's no one single path to the presidency, for example. It really is learning from all of it. And so there are lots of wonderful opportunities in higher education, and how to learn administration. And so it's not in the books. I mean, there's always the theory in the books, but it's always the lived experience for all of us with almost everything. You've got to apply it. It's never the way it was written in the textbook. You know, so you learn from all those experiences, and you build up a body of experience and knowledge that helps you when you get to those positions of responsibility. And that's true of whatever it is you choose to do.
So what made you decide to go into religious life?
Oh dear, taking your time, I'm sorry. The question is, what made me go into religious life? You know, I went to public school, as I told you, and I really didn't know sisters. We always had religious instruction where we went to the Catholic school and participated in it, but somewhere in the back of my mind was always that attraction and draw. I can't tell you where it came from or why it was, but then I put it aside and went on with my life, and I'll tell you how I tell this story on myself, because it's the gospel truth. This is how I decided to enter religious life. I had been thinking about it seriously, but I was also dating seriously at the same time. And so the ring was coming, and I knew that. And so I knew I had to make a decision. Take the ring, or try out this thing called religious life. And I always thought, this was my deep thinking, if I entered religious life and it didn't work out, I could leave and move on. If I got married and decided really I should have been in religious life, that wasn't going to work. That wasn't going to happen. So it was one of those things a 20-year-old decides that it was the right moment to do it, and that's what pushed me to go at that time. I may have gone later, but I knew I was at a decision point in my life of one way or the other, and so that's really the great noble way in which I entered religious life at that time. But it worked out.